as the Archbishop of York, Stephen, I mean, you're very aware, and you're very much at the hierarchy of the church. Do you think that the Church of England's centrality to the United Kingdom as its the state is something good, or is it in some ways a hindrance? And the church occupies a space at the heart of the political system. May not be formally making sort of laws and whatnot, but what I want to ask is, I mean, today, do you think that's an anomaly, or do you think that that's something that could help in a multi-faith country?
Yeah, I mean, I could argue it both ways. It is unusual. There are very, very few other examples of it around the world where the church is established and the church has by right, and is therefore a pillar of the kind of famous unwritten constitution of the United Kingdom, that this is the established church of this land, and there are bishops. I sit in the House of Lords. There we are. It always makes me smile when journalists say, that church and politics shouldn't mix, and I think, well, hang on a minute, I'm a member. I'm a member of Parliament, or I sit in the House of Lords. That has been the British system for a very, very long time, and there are clearly problems and challenges with that. I think some people say that it can blunt the prophetic edge of the church. We are not so much close to power, we're right there in the corridors and seats of power. For how can we speak prophetically to power? And I understand that argument. But my experience is that the bishops in the House of Lords is a relatively small number, 26 of us. Our role within the House of Lords is different from the other lords. There's the Lords temporal, everybody else, and then 26 Lords spiritual with a specific role. And I believe it gives us an opportunity to speak about the things of God, to speak about faith, to speak up on behalf of all faiths, not just, we're not there representing the Church of England. We are there as part of the constitution of our nation. So we're there speaking for all faiths, not just our own. And I believe we can be a power for good within that. But I could argue it both ways. Sure. But I think if we were starting from scratch, would we come up with a system like this? Well, almost certainly no. But I think it feels to me, and again, I realise that, would I say this if I wasn't the Archbishop of York? I just don't know. But it feels to me that the presence of the church as the established church is woven into the history of this land. And I'm always cautious about cutting those things off. Yeah. Because when you cut a woven piece of material, you think you're cutting a straight line, but actually as soon as you've made the cut, everything starts to fray. And that's my worry with these things, especially with unwritten constitutions.
That's a very good way of putting it.
So I know that actually I don't have great power or influence, in government. But I do have a voice and a place which is there by right, and therefore I'm able to do things and say things which I believe contribute to the common good.
That's very interesting.
Can I just ask about that?
Yeah, you want to ask about multi-faith issues?
Yeah, and I think that just as you were saying earlier on about the fact that people of faith who aren't Christian would probably choose a Christian school to send their children to in preference to a secular school. I think if we were asked the question, would you prefer not to have bishops sitting in the House of Lords and no representation, or actually have bishops? And I would personally say I'd like to have some spiritual presence in the House of Lords. So if it's Christian, that's fine. And as you say, you're not just speaking on behalf of Christian, but actually you're speaking on behalf of people of faith. In relation to that sort of specific having a voice in Parliament, there, has there been any kind of legislation which Lord Spiritual, if you like, have had some influence on, which you're particularly proud of making faith's voice heard, and therefore that legislation sort of coming about.
Well, yes, I mean, there's probably lots and lots of examples where, I mean, of course, it's always with others because we're a small voice. So it's always a matter of lending our voice in coalitions of goodwill, usually across party boundaries. But the thing that immediately springs to mind where I was personally involved, not that I take any great personal credit for this, but it was a good example of, I think, how the church can raise the moral temperature of government, was over child refugees. So you may remember a few years ago, Lord Dubs, who himself was put on a train in Berlin by his family as a small boy in 1939, 1940, as part of the Kindertransport. Came to this country, now is a member of a Labour member of the House of Lords, a great man. And there was widespread across the political spectrum view a few years ago that the number of unaccompanied child refugees that this country was taking was inadequate and going against the grain of our history. So Lord Dubs proposed an amendment to the bill that was passing through the House of Lords to address that. And the first thing he did was turn to the Lord Spiritual for support, because I think he knew politically and tactically, if the bishops are getting behind something, even though we'll be accused by some in some parts of the press of meddling in politics, actually, on the whole, we don't do that often. But if we do lend our voice, it actually takes a little bit out of party politics. To say there's some ethical issues that I happen to, we have a system to make sure that there has to be a bishop on duty in the House of Lords every day, because we lead the prayers every day. And I happen to be the duty bishop, and we have a duty bishop system to make sure one of us is always there. I was the duty bishop that week, so it came to me, and I was honoured and delighted to second the amendment and speak in favour of it, and it got passed, and eventually the government accepted it, even though I'm afraid and ashamed to say they never acted upon it, but they did accept it, or didn't act upon it fully. But there's been, I guess there's been hundreds of examples of that where the church has contributed to decisions, but we're very rarely the initiator of the decisions.